to everyone who joined us from, wow, I see people literally from across the world. Boston, Singapore, Malaysia, Paris, wow. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, especially people in Asia for whom it's quite late in the evening. Really glad you can be a part of this event. We decided at the Digital Asia Hub to do something. We're not the only ones wanting to do something because of COVID, of course. But I think for us, what was really interesting was we're so used to seeing systems that are allegedly set up for our own good that will have long-term impact in all kinds of wonderful ways. And I think we were really concerned about seeing what are the ways in which systems that might seem necessary, might seem proportionate in the short to medium term, might actually set us up for failure in the long term, or might actually have really deep lasting impact in ways that are less pleasant. You know, what happens once the banging of pots and the singing and all of the balcony concerts stop, and we're left with the surveillance infrastructure that is really, really hard to dismantle. One other announcement I wanted to make today is we're really thrilled that the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, one of the federally funded German foundations, has come on board to help support the series, which means we can pay all of our speakers a very modest honorarium, more than anything, just to not take their time and their insights for granted at a time when paid labor is such a fraught, contested thing. So thank you so much to Christiane and the others who've helped to make that possible. So without further ado, contact tracing, one of the most vile, contested issues, something people have really, really strong opinions about, either terribly techno-solutionist or very alarmist about how it's the end of all things. So we have a really great group of people, Sutawan Chanprasert from Thailand, who's joining us from Bangkok. We have Haksoo Ko from Seoul and Michael Veale from London, all of whom are looking at different aspects of contact tracing. So Ploy agreed to help sketch out the Asian landscape, talk about the different apps that have been rolled out, and also chronologically, we thought it would make more sense that Ploy started, given Asia was one of the front runners in spearheading the technology and the appification of this crisis. And Haksoo will drill down more deeply into Korea. And Michael will tell us about the DP3T initiative and privacy preserving options for contact tracing, which help balance a lot of the competing concerns here. So without further ado, Ploy, who founded DigitalReach Asia, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Okay, so so we're going to talk about privacy and contact tracing in Southeast Asia first, and then we're going to start with so we're going to talk about the overall picture first of the contact tracing in Southeast Asia before we go to the privacy concerns about it, and at both technical and policy level. And also we will have a conclusion about it. So let's start with the overall pictures of the contact tracing in Southeast Asia. So here, next slide, please. The slide, it looks like the slide is not working. Okay, so I'm going to refer to the official contact tracing here, since some of the countries in the region have many tracing apps. So we're going to refer to just only the contact tracing app first, and then Singapore became the first in the region that came up with contact tracing in March, and shortly after that many countries follow. So in the region we have Indonesia that follow with its own app called PeduliLindungi, Thailand developed its own one as well called Chana, and then Vietnam they come up with Bluezone, and Malaysia with the MyTrace app. So far, there have been low adoption rates among this app, even though even in Singapore, that is known for its high computer literacy. And this app use Bluetooth technology for contact tracing with Thailand Chana that is quite transparent in terms of collecting location data apart from also using the Bluetooth. We don't know about other tracing apps available. We hope to figure it out soon in the future. So after this app was introduced, because of the low adoption rate, there are also other approach as well in terms of contact tracing. And these are not an app, and these are actually web platforms that happen in Singapore and Thailand under the same logic. So in Singapore, it's called Safe Entry, and then in Thailand, it's called Thai Chana. So when people go to, well, let me explain it first. So this web platform is actually for the government to control people, I mean the number of people and use for contact tracing when they go to places. So when you're in front of the shop or mall or something like that, you scan the QR code for check-in and then scan the QR code for check-out at certain places. And for some places, it's mandatory, like big department store, shop, restaurant, bank, hospital, schools, hotel, or at your office as well. So yeah, you have to scan the QR code provided by the place in the front of the shop before you are allowed to get in. And this is a mean to control a number of people in the place. And if someone are COVID-19 positive, like if they figure out later, the authority will check the collected data of where this person went to, at what time, and how many people were there in that place. So from our observation, within a few days after its launch, many million people data have been gathered because it's compulsory, even more effective than the app itself, because it's important for them to scan the QR code, otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to enter the place. So next we look at the privacy concern. Next slide, please. So when the platform and when the app are launched, privacy is really undermined among the contact tracing apps and platform in the region. And the authority claimed that the tracing app concerned about privacy. Like claims include having anonymous ID, collected data being encrypted, and being open source, for example. So however, there are still a lot of missing aspects that have raised concern about privacy. And let's talk about the app first, and then let's start with some technical aspect. So we don't have, well, at the moment, as we work on the app, as we work on looking at the platform, we don't have a thorough analysis of all the tracing app and platform that are available yet in the region, due to our own limited resources on our end, and as well as some of the app are not really that easy to examine. And okay, so start with the app being open source. Usually when we talk about the app being open source, the logic behind it is that the actual code of the app is open source so that people can view and improve security, right? And that's a claim by the government that the app being open source so that people can be assured of its security. But the claim is not true, because it's actually the source code of the app or the software behind it, in which we call reference implementation, that is open source. It's not the actual code of the app. And this doesn't mean that it's not useful. It's still easier to examine. And it'll use useful in terms of making the app more transparent, and people can still examine on how the design or the protocol of the app works in this case. So even though the actual code of the app is open source, there's a bigger concern about it, which is in the overall security design of the app. So what we have found so far, information about the tracing app in Southeast Asia is actually quite limited. Singapore TraceTogether as well as Safe Entry provide relatively a lot more information compared to others that are available in the region, which is good, but still there are some part about privacy that need to be watched out. There are some way that a real identity of a TraceTogether user can be exposed. A study earlier actually shows that the temporary ID that it generate using the Singaporean Ministry of Health key use reversible encryption, which is not the best option for security because reversible encryption has the ability to decrypt the user ID and timestamp, which log substantial amount of information. They are processed with Google server in terms of TraceTogether, and unfortunately, Google can see this data, as we all know about the Google reputation, about its stance on privacy. So this is a concern. So regarding Chana of Thailand, the code available on GitHub at the time that we look at it did not tell anything much. It is actually too basic to be claimed that the app or the source code is open source, as it doesn't tell much about security design or function. What we know is actually from the article that is written by the team of developer. So we know that it collects GPS data and store information in the Amazon Web Service. Next slide, please. So some might wonder why apps that, next slide, please. So some might wonder why apps that collect GPS data is sensitive. It's sensitive because it can, sorry, back. Can you go back to the previous slide? This is the conclusion already. Previous. Yes, thank you. So some might wonder why apps that collect GPS data is sensitive. It's sensitive because it can reveal a lot about a person and their lifestyle, from where they frequently visit, how they live their life, things like that. Particularly, I mean, with they are concerned about, particularly about those two platforms like Safe Entry and Chana, that you have to scan the QR code before you enter into a place. There are concerns about how these places, I mean, if some people going to some sensitive place, how do they manage in sensitive place like a gay bar, a strip club, or a specialized clinic? Like there are those marginalized individuals like LGBTQI people, or HIV positive individual that can be vulnerable if exposed for social stigmatization in this situation. We haven't had a chance to look into Chana and Safe Entry technical aspect on privacy yet, but the logic behind the app are quite concerning when it applies to sensitive places like that. And regarding putting the information in the AWS, the Amazon Web Service, there's actually a law in the United States called Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data, or we call it the Cloud Act, that allow authority to obtain information held by the US registered data company, regardless to where in the world that information is collected from. So that's a concern. Going to mention a little bit about those apps that we don't have much information at the moment in Southeast Asia. So the Indonesia PeduliLindungi, from what we know, is not open source. So it's really hard to examine. The app itself, it's also obfuscated. The information about the app is also very limited, especially those that is available in English. It's likely to be centralized. And Vietnam Bluezone has its source code open source. We have looked into it a bit, but it's still, we actually, it's a work in progress at the moment of finding out about what Bluezone do. And
So you have 2
Malaysia
minutes left.
MyTrace. Okay, and Malaysia MyTrace, we're currently monitoring whether it's going to be open source or not. These apps available in the region are likely to be centralized and stored in the government database somewhere. So I hope that people here have heard about the collaboration between Apple and Google on tracing technology. And unfortunately, we cannot dig deeper into this time limit. As the Apple and Google technology are rolling out, we'll see how the situation will change as there are many requirements as to support decentralized model when one official app per country only can use the technology. So just to give some brief information about this, that the Apple technology doesn't really support the centralized function. That much of the tracing after that centralized have some issue with iOS device like TraceTogether. If you see it on the if you see the review of it on App Store, they have a very low rating, and a lot of people complain about its function. So from this situation described, we also relied a lot on tech company that as we leave the data with them or use that technology, Google, Apple, and Amazon. So from the policy aspect, next slide, please. In the region, we don't really have like a great robust personal data like GDPR or the California data, the California privacy data. An enforcement mechanism would make the personal data and privacy protection more vulnerable. Most of the data protection law at the national level also do not include the government agency as part of the law, which give opportunity for data to be misused and exploited easily. And law on data protection in Southeast Asia are also considered too weak and unlikely to hold a powerful tech company accountable if some things go wrong. So here there are two concerns about the data collected from the app and platform, which is about, first is about integrity, and the second is about the competence. So the first one is whether those who are taking care of the collected data will not misuse or exploit it for something else, like surveillance when the law is too weak to stipulate how the data to be treated. And some of the platform apps do not have the clear privacy policy as well. And also informed consent is not a concern here, it's not part of it. The second one is the competence. Like if it's stored, like if it's stored in the database, the security measure is secure enough to keep the data safe from any technical attack or not. So we don't know about that. So the conclusion is the contact tracing app or platform in the region are rolled out without the right to privacy being overlooked. Most of them provide little or no transparency on how collect data is treated. And lack of robust personal data regulation and enforcement in the region make the situation worse. So there's a need to have that to ensure that data will be kept safely. So given the long history of human rights abuse in the hand of the government in the region, record of digital surveillance, and also failure to properly handle the data breach situation also raise a question whether we should trust them or not. So that's the end of my presentation. Sorry.
Floyd, thank you so much for racing through all
that.
that.
A little bit over time.
That's okay, that's okay. There was a lot to cover, and you're one person that's covering a lot of different countries in the region, so that was fine. So I think there's a lot for us to come back to in the Q&A, but just to round up the Asian situation, we'll have Haksoo Ko from Seoul National University to pitch in particularly about the situation in South Korea, and then turn over to Michael. Haksoo?
Yeah, I'll share my slide.
Great.
Okay. I'll talk about what is going on in South Korea. South Korea has pretty complex the scheme, and my overview will be only partial. So the general statistics. South Korea began witnessing cases from around January 20th. We first found a case around that time. And for a month or so, the number increased, but not in dramatic fashion. But toward the end of February, the number of new cases began picking up. So around that time, the government began implementing more aggressive measure and more close contact tracing system began to be put in place. And toward the middle of March, the number of new cases began to stabilize. And during the past several weeks, it has been stabilized. Daily new cases has been at around 20 or 30. During the past few days, there has been new uptick. We'll have to see. So the overall number, this number is from a couple of days ago. In the whole country of slightly over 45 million, the number of confirmed cases is about 11,000, and about 270 people who are deceased. So in relative terms, this is not a bad number. So what has been taking place in terms of contact tracing? I mean, in general, South Korea has very stringent data privacy law. There's law called Personal Information Protection Act, PIPA, P-I-P-A for short. And that law has very strong requirements for obtaining consent. And at least in some respect, this privacy law in Korea is even stricter than GDPR. But in 2015, Korea had experienced, suffered from the MERS outbreak, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And after experiencing this syndrome, I mean, there were several hundred infected cases at the time, and dozens of patients died from MERS. And so compared to the current pandemic, in terms of scale or the impact is very minuscule, but nonetheless, MERS was a new experience from a Korean perspective. And so after experiencing the MERS outbreak in 2015, they changed the law, not the law in data privacy, but law covering infectious disease. The name of the law is Contagious Disease Prevention Act. So there was a major amendment of this law, Contagious Disease Prevention Act. And the main part which changes at the time was to set up this mandatory system to collect information from the infected individuals and the people who are in close proximity. So the main part is this, Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Korean CDC, serves as a main repository of all the information. So these are the types of information that can be gathered. So from mobile carriers, location information of an infected individual would, through the police, go to Korean CDC. Immigration record would go to Korean CDC. CCTV, closed circuit TV footage would go to Korean CDC. Transaction data from your credit card or debit card or prepaid card transactions would go to the Korean CDC. I mean, the Korea, pretty much every person has a smartphone. Among all the people that I know in Korea, I have seen only one person who doesn't have smartphone, which who is my mom. So there, everybody, practically speaking, has smartphone, and also everybody has credit card and debit card, and these days almost no cash is used for transactions, even at small grocery stores. So that kind of detailed information is gathered, the Korean CDC. So with that information, they engage in detailed analysis, epidemiological analysis, and then they disseminate some part of the information to the public. So in that respect, it's kind of two-way street. They gather information from the infected or suspected to be infected. So data is collected in kind of central authority, and then this central authority would disseminate part of the information to the public. The channel to disseminate the information to the public is two. One channel is through the Ministry of Health and Welfare. This ministry does conduct daily briefings and maintains a separate website for COVID-19. And also municipal and local governments are given information from Korean CDC. And so there are two channels that the general public gets the information. And the way it works is, we get emergency alert. This is a screen capture from a mobile phone. So on a daily basis, you would get several of these alerts, sometimes a dozen or several dozens. So this message would let you know there's a new case in which location, that sort of information. And as you see this new, the Guardian article, the alert, emergency alert, expose private lives sometimes. So what kind of issues are out there? As I mentioned, this is, the whole scheme is two-way. Compiling the information at a central authority, that's one way. The other way is from the central authority to the general public. This two-way street doesn't necessarily have to be have to provide mirror image data to the other side. There perhaps need to be some level of information asymmetry, but the messages, emergency alert messages contain this type of information. In South Korea, they contain a lot. The names are never revealed for the infected, but the gender and age, their travel log, workspace, home address, and the hospital where they visited, that sort of information is revealed to the public. And I mentioned, the data that's revealed or disseminated to the public is one part comes out of the central ministry. Another part is coming out of municipal and local governments. By definition, there's a single ministry, and they have been maintaining a consistent internal guideline. And municipal and local governments, by definition, there are a lot. And even if they are given guidance, individual municipalities and localities are given authority to interpret the guidelines, and individual municipalities and localities interpreted the guidelines in different manner, and there has been inconsistency in that respect. And so what happened? This is one episode. This is a screenshot from a daily newspaper in Korea. And as the title says, there are three fencers who got tested positive. And this is from this newspaper article. I highlighted these players are from national fencing team. So there are not too many national fencing team players. And one who got tested positive is a 25-year-old, and the gender female, and not just fencing, but subcategory of fencing, épée, and among the épée fencing players, female fencing players, the total number of national team is 8. So this much is very, they didn't give the names of these players, but very much revealing. So I did search, and it took less than 1 minute, maybe 20 seconds. I landed on this page, Korean Fencing Federation. They maintain a website, and this shows épée. So female épée players, there are, voila, 8 players, and they say 8. And if you click photos of these players, you can see their age and which individual teams they belong to, and some other information. So I can easily match one-on-one who this person is, and there are 2 other who got tested positive, and so finding out who that person is and making a one-on-one match, that's, well, in this instance, very simple. So that kind of thing took place, and this is a new development from a few days ago. QR code system is now being deployed. QR code system for nightclubs and bars and some other nightlife establishments. So the requirements have been out there to maintain records of the visitors and customers. With this new QR code system, installing QR code system itself is mandatory, but using the QR code is not mandatory. So the government has been mindful of the privacy aspect. So using QR code itself is not mandatory, and also the institutions which issue QR code is separate from the institution which maintains the record of individual establishments. That means identifying information is maintained separately from this location information. And why this QR code? That's because of a recent incident where a nightclub, in particular, where homosexuals tend to go, became a hot spot. Out of that particular club, there have been well over 100 who got tested positive. And the authorities trying to trace the people who visited that establishment, they figured out these visitors gave incorrect phone numbers. So, from the perspective of the visitors, it's natural to have incentive not to give correct information, because in Korea, being homosexual is a taboo subject. So they in general would prefer not to give too much personal information, including their phone numbers, and the authorities had hard time contacting them. So once this QR code is in place, giving incorrect information wouldn't be possible. But at the same time, as I mentioned, using installing is mandatory, but using is not mandatory. So we'll have to see how this will play out. That finishes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haksoo Ko. And we're hearing so much about how there might be a second wave in South Korea. So we're also really keen to see whether the second wave of the use of the app in the circumstances you outlined is also going to throw up new challenges. Without further ado, I'm just going to turn over to Michael, who's going to sort of share the more global perspective and particularly outline the privacy preserving approaches in this space. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Malavika. I'm a lecturer at University College London, and I'm also one of the co-authors and co-researchers on a project called DP3T, and that stands for Decentralized Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing. This project was set up, it's hard to find the exact date for some very fast-moving projects, but around February this year. And it was a group of researchers who were really responding to the political pressure, what Malavika called the appification of this crisis. We saw, particularly looking at East Asia, there was huge political interest in apps that were coming from countries particularly that had much greater preparedness, had been thinking about this for longer in the context of SARS and MERS, but also aware that these apps might not only encounter legal problems in stronger privacy regimes, but also problems of uptake and acceptance culturally, particularly in light of in countries like Germany or the Netherlands, which really had quite difficult times with such databases in the past, and also being mindful of what we do know, which is that infrastructure established during pandemics tends to stick around, which is why this is a great series for Digital Asia Hub to run. We were a team of epidemiologists, privacy engineers, law and policy scholars, and more, and getting together. And privacy engineering is the field of really having your cake and eating it in terms of privacy and information. You try and define the goals of a system. You say, what do you want a system to do and also not do? And you try and achieve those goals functionally well, using the minimal data possible, ensuring that every actor only has access to the minimal data they require. In doing so, we drew up a system for decentralized contact tracing or proximity tracing based on Bluetooth, not location data. The idea of this system is effectively that there are different ways to run these kind of systems. So all Bluetooth proximity tracing systems are sending out signals from people's devices and recording the signals they hear from other people's devices in the environment. In a centralized system, the signals that a phone sends out are given to it by a server. The characteristic of this is that any one of these signals from anybody can be decrypted or matched by the server into a unique identifier for that device. That might be just an identifier, or it might be a phone number, or it could be even more information. But everything that's sent out in the environment can be decrypted by the server. So it's a bit like you're broadcasting an ID card when you go around the place, even if that ID card can only be read by some people. The decentralized system works differently. Every number that you send out from your device is completely randomly created by your device itself. It is secret to everybody. Only your device knows what the next number you're going to emit is, or knows that it's tied to your device. It doesn't come from a server. And so that's initially a better prospect for various reasons, and I'm going to talk about why. And then, so you've got those two differences. Then the systems differ in one extra way. In a centralized system, when you are diagnosed, you upload all of the keys that you have heard from other people to a central server. Now, these were not identifiable to you, but they do make sense to that server. And so you have the node of you, and suddenly you have everybody that you have encountered recently. What this means is you're actually sending data about other people. So when in a centralized system, what you're doing is you are transmitting data that relates to people in your environment. So say I was sitting in a cafe and two people, A and B, were on a table next to me. I later go and test positive for COVID-19, and I upload these identifiers that I heard. What you're doing is you're effectively uploading at 2:15, I saw A and B, they were co-located together at the same time. You're uploading information about those two people being in the same place at the same time. If you were to also donate your location data, that's one phrase that's being used in data donation, you're actually donating location data of A and B. You're not really just donating it of yourself. So you're sending it about other people. In a decentralized system, what we were trying to achieve as well is that you're really only sending about yourself. So the difference is, instead of sending the identifiers you see about other people in the environment, what you do is you send the identifiers that you emitted and you send them to everybody else's phones. So effectively, people on their phones have a bingo card and they can say, okay, did I see this person? Did I see this person? And they do that in the privacy of their own device. Their phone then can locally match if they were at risk and notify them if they should take further action. Or indeed, it can send their phone number to a central server that it can be called by a public health authority. We don't consider that a relevant part of centralization, because what we're trying to decentralize is a very sensitive social graph. Once the protocol finishes, say becomes a push notification, an app can, in theory, do whatever it wants with that data. Now, we don't think it should do whatever it wants, but that's outside of what we were developing as a protocol. So that's roughly the differences. And privacy is one thing. So we talk a lot about privacy, but then some people say, well, privacy in a pandemic, you can give it up to some degree. And that's true in the law. That is an allowed trade-off to be made. However, function creep is really important here, especially. The decentralized system is very difficult to build any persistent identifier on. So you can't build on top traffic light systems for entering based on your behavior. You can't start doing quarantine control or tracking individuals or building immunity passports on top of the system that we built. It's just not a mathematically compatible, they're not mathematically compatible systems. We were working on this. We developed it for Switzerland, for several other countries have pledged to use our system, and we're rolling it out. It then became Germany flipped, and some of these were triggered as well by Apple and Google adopting our system in their operating system. And Apple and Google are not my biggest friends. I have regulatory complaints against both of them. Google, many, Apple, I think just one or two. They did choose a privacy-preserving approach in this case, and we'd been talking to them. They state on the record their system is inspired by the DP3T system. And so, well, nice for researchers, but a smile on our faces to see things being used. But there are some worries, and that's where it comes to what happens after the music stops. We were not, many of us were not advocates of it going into the operating system of the devices. That is instead of just allowing access to the Bluetooth stack and allowing an app to run on top, Apple and Google have suggested that it's going into the operating system. And once it's in there, it becomes hard to get out. And many things in our societies run on the metaphor of contagion. Is criminality contagious? Is this something you can start to apply for criminality? Is this a technology that's going to stay with us for a long time, perhaps in fear of future pandemics? Who turns it off? Another relevant component here is interoperability between countries. Centralized systems and decentralized systems do not work well together. Effectively, they're functioning in so different ways that the only way to really run them together is to run a decentralized system underneath a centralized system in a country that chooses a centralized option. That's really the main way of even having these play together. And that's not really interoperability, that's just parallel systems. So what you find is that there's a bit of a zero-sum game. Country's going to go decentralized or centralized. The only countries in Europe that are remaining on a centralized path are France, the UK, and Norway. Every other country that has declared that they are using a contact tracing app has declared they're using a decentralized one or moving to a decentralized one. So that's interoperability is important for opening borders and so on, and something to be considered going forwards. The other thing to bear in mind, which is really stark, is that Apple, particularly with its restrictions that have already been mentioned by Ploy on the operating system, they have taken a very shrewd technical political move. They decided they will not allow telephones use Bluetooth in the background. So Bluetooth in the background was never really particularly possible anyway. There's some hacky workarounds that you can do that eats the battery and are not very reliable, depending on if you choose a UK style workaround or a Singaporean style workaround. But effectively, Bluetooth in the background has been banned for commercial tracking reasons. Apple and Google said we will allow phones to do contact tracing, but they will only enable technology that allows you to upload the identifiers you have emitted to the world. They do not enable a piece of code in their API that allows you to upload the identifiers that you have seen from the world, seen other people's phones emit. So it misses a building block you need to create a centralized system. This has caused controversy, particularly in France, where France has turned the debate into one about digital sovereignty or not. I think that's a very important debate to have, and I hope we really describe and think about how we open up operating systems in the future. But it does seem to be an incorrect debate to be having right now at the cost of making systems that function. This is clearly a use of power, and it should sharpen our minds to what's happening. The last point I want to make is around law and legal soft landings for these technologies. So we effectively, one concern is that both the apps might be made mandatory by the state, but also that it may be permissible for employers and public services and so on, and shops and things, to require you to use an app before you go into a location. And with only 80% of the UK having smartphone access and fewer having access to smartphones that have the exact functionality needed to run these technologies, that causes a significant problem. So with colleagues in the UK and actually across the world, we've created a draft UK law back in the early April, the Coronavirus Safeguards Bill, which I invite everybody to have a look at, which has safeguards around that and more. The UK has refused to put in a bill like this, which is creating concern. But Switzerland, for example, and Australia both have put in laws that enshrine these types of restrictions. And we think those are really important going forwards, including around sunset clauses and working out how to turn the technology off when we're finished with it, and indeed working out when we are finished with it. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was a really useful explainer, very easy to understand of the difference between centralized and decentralized, as well as the sort of nuances of the protocol that you've helped build and that we're seeing being deployed across Europe. As well as I think you touched on something that I think many countries in Asia are starting to fear a little bit, which is the question of mission creep and these apps that are used to now expand beyond just contact tracing to include digital health and build a much larger sort of ecosystem around using personal data for that. So that's something that I think many countries in the region are concerned about. I see we've had some excellent questions, and I'm going to read a couple of them. Ploy, we have a question for you from Pratiksha Ashok on the question of storing data on the consumer mobile device instead of an external server. She cited GDPR, as Michael just explained, on how that sort of causes of us that data be stored in mobile devices. What kind of solutions do you see either in Thailand or in Southeast Asia for that? And then there's also two questions, one from Natalie Pang and Gayatri around the particular concerns of GPS being used versus Bluetooth proximity data, which I think, Michael, you also touched upon. And so maybe you can also sort of help share some insights there. Yeah, Ploy, or if you can respond to the first question, particularly on storing data on the consumer device.
I think Michael can help answering this question as well. So storing the data on the device is the idea behind the decentralized model. And it's safer than using the centralized model in which the data is usually stored in the government database. And in this case, you have to really trust those who taking care of the database and also those who run the backend server as well, which can be tech company like Google or Amazon, something like that. So having the decentralized is better in terms of privacy. So
yeah, I think
I'm
her question
going
was more
to,
getting to if you see any solutions in the region of trying to follow the decentralized model or trying to store data on the device. So I think Singapore is one example, but maybe Thailand or other parts. Is any government looking at this at all?
okay, so sorry about that. As Apple and Google roll out its API, so I think that the team behind TraceTogether is working on things because of the centralized model that TraceTogether is using is not working well on the Apple device, on iOS device. So I think that there has been some news feature lately about the team is looking to change something like that. And I'm not really sure about other apps that is available in the region, whether they are doing well or not. Well, actually from my observations far on both Google Play and App Store, the reviews are actually quite mixed in terms of like those in Indonesia, Vietnam, things like that. I don't think, well, given the political situation in the region, we all know that it's quite authoritarian and they just want to kind of take control over it as much as possible. So I'm not really sure whether they want to make it into the decentralized one because the technical function of the app doesn't work. So they are forced into that and they wanted to use they want to be more flexible with the rollout of the technology by Apple and Google, things like that. There might be a chance, but we have to see. So the two other questions about privacy concern regarding the Bluetooth. Okay, so the Bluetooth low energy technology is actually safer than the GPS location, the GPS data location technique. But there are a concern about, I think when it comes to the Bluetooth when it comes to the Bluetooth technology, the privacy concerns actually in the design of the app and like where it's stored, how it works, and whether there's a chance for those who control the server, those who control the database to know who really behind what the ID or identity of who behind the data collected or not. So that's the concerns about it regarding
Thanks, Ploy. We have just a couple more questions, I think. One for Haksoo. We have a question whether mobile alerts that you showed on your slide, whether they increase anxiety among the public. That's an interesting one. And generally, there's a question of whether there's any fear of backlash from people who, from individuals or states who believe these apps are a form of national solidarity. And finally, we have a question from Logan, who's asking, do you see any governments being interested in adopting more expansive Korean-style legal frameworks for gathering data for public health? So maybe, Haksoo, I'll turn over to you, and then I'll give the final word to Michael.
Okay. Emergency alerts. I mean, the alerts serve several purposes. One purpose is just giving information to the public, and and being transparent, not showing that the government just monopolize the information, and what the government gathers, the government is then sharing with the public. So in that sense, kind of evidence of transparency. But the question would be, how detailed information, how granular information the government should disseminate to the public. And about anxiety, I mean, the other side of the coin is being alert. So, sending out the alert would keep the public, oh, this is not a peaceful time, you should be careful. And another purpose, the third purpose would be giving the message to the potential suspect infected individuals. So sometimes there was a newly discovered case at a particular restaurant. So if you have been this particular restaurant during the past several days, please contact health authorities, that kind of messages. And using this methodology, would that help for national solidarity? It's a hard question. It may or may not. There are two sides. I mean, the message or the information that's coming out of the central authority to the general public, it would, in theory, help maintaining national solidarity. But the question might then be among the general public. So for the minority group of people, could be homosexuals, could be national or ethnic minorities. Once they, are being pinpointed, they try to find a pigeonhole and try to hide from the public scene. So that itself could be a problem. And from a pragmatic perspective, once these minority group try to hide from the public view, it now then becomes more difficult to do tracing and tracking. So there are both pros and cons, and with this Korean style contact tracing, would there be a possibility of wider adoption in other countries? I don't know, but I spoke with some reporters from the US and from some European countries, and the general response was, oh, this is very intrusive and perhaps not easy to adopt in their countries. So maybe based on a few contexts that I had, perhaps not, but who knows? That'll be my answer.
Thanks, Haksoo. Michael, maybe do you want to touch on, I think maybe also whether the Bluetooth versus GPS, or also the question of Korean style legal frameworks for data gathering, whether you see that happening in Europe at all? And I think the final question on false alarms from contact tracing apps, I think that's especially from Bluetooth.
I want to add one other thing that Japan has confirmed it's having a decentralized app based on the Apple Google API and DP3T. So that's just one country in the region that's going in that direction. It largely does. It will hinge quite a lot on Android and iPhone penetration. Countries that have significant iPhone penetration will find themselves under more pressure to do that than countries that have Android penetration, because you can adapt Androids for centralized apps too. Quick point I want to make about the false alarms, with two sides of false alarms actually. So one side, which is the anxiety. This also opens up the space of phishing of many kinds, people being called, told to stay at home, told to do all sorts of things. That's a concern that's going to be very difficult to address, and that we're already seeing in some countries, and we're going to see in more countries. The legal frameworks, I'd say it's worrying to make these kind of rules in a crisis, because if there have to be more overarching rules, reforming something very delicate in a crisis is always a challenge. As opposed to thinking about Korean-style manual contact tracing, is of course very invasive with access to a lot of different kinds of data sets. What we're seeing in the UK is the contact tracers that are hired by the UK government are being told to work at home on their own devices. And that's going to be a security challenge because if they have access, especially to particularly sensitive types of data they can query, that's obviously going to be something that's very difficult to deal with. The false alarms, different kinds of false alarms through the wall. We've actually got in DP3T some quite nifty ways to mitigate this that relate to secret sharing. We need to keep working with phone providers and so on to get those implemented better. There are also things you can do like not upload your whole day of contacts and select when you want to upload. But really the kind of through walls thing, you have to be quite near a very thin wall for a long period of time. It's not just brushing past someone quickly. So that is minimal, but it's still a concern. But sometimes it's going to be a concern we're going to have to live with, I think, if we want to use apps at all using Bluetooth. And GPS just doesn't work indoors, so GPS is not really a useful option for contact tracing, although it might be for quarantine control if people really want to think about how they're going to enforce that.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael. And I'm also looking at the time, and I think with that, we will conclude the session. I want to thank all our speakers, Ploy, Haksoo, and Michael, for sharing the diverse perspectives. It's looking so different, as you see, in Southeast Asia to South Korea, and to even within Europe, a lot of diversity, as Michael just mentioned and explained. Well, the show is called When the Music's Over, and we will be touching on these themes and questions of mission creep, especially going forward over the next few months. And so we will try to do more events touching on some of the themes that our speakers talked on. If you are not signed up, you should go to our website and you can sign up to get on our mailing list. So you will make sure you get updates for all our next events. This session will also be put up on the website, the video and the audio. So if you want to check it out, you can, as well as potentially the slides that our speaker shared. So thank you so much for joining from all different time zones, whether it's early in the morning or late at night. Thank you very much. And look forward to seeing you in future sessions. We'll be doing this every Thursday. Thanks, everyone.